Hi friends, welcome to Beautifully Bookish Bethany. In today's video, I'm going to be talking about some very popular standalone books that I think are worth the hype. This video was partly inspired by Books with Emily Fox, who's done similar videos, but I wanted to give you my own list of books that are really popular, either because they've been really popular on Booktube or they've been big New York Times bestsellers that I've read and loved and definitely think are worth the hype. Let's go ahead and get started. I have 8 books to talk to you about today, and the first one on my list is The Only Good Indians by Stephen Graham Jones. Stephen Graham Jones is an Indigenous author who writes horror novels. The Only Good Indians came out in 2020, and I think it's very, very good and definitely worth the hype that I've been seeing for it. This follows 4 Native American men who, after a disturbing incident from their youth, are put into a struggle for their lives. It includes an elk-headed woman who might be a demon, and it's pretty creepy, has some very violent and disturbing moments, and is incredibly well written in my opinion. It's also got a lot of interesting things to say about Native American identity and issues facing Indigenous communities. In terms of pacing, this is interesting because it'll be slow-paced, character-driven, and then punctuated by these really intense moments of violence, and that continues throughout the book. I really loved it, and if horror is your genre and you're not squeamish about things, I do think this one is worth the hype. Next on my list is a YA contemporary novel with a slight speculative element to it. This is Slay by Brittany Morris. This is about a Black teen girl who creates a virtual reality online RPG video game that is specifically intended for the Black community and celebrates Blackness in all of its forms. But when a player of this game dies, she gets on the news and people start calling the game racist because white people aren't allowed in. It's an interesting book that grapples with a lot of important ideas, and in terms of the slight speculative element, it's the virtual reality video game. And what I think is really interesting is some of the critiques that I have seen of this book are people thinking that the video game isn't realistic. I mean, yes, but the author acknowledges that and in fact has worked as a game developer herself. So it's not intended to be realistic, and I feel like if what you're critiquing in this is whether or not it's possible for this teen girl to have created this giant video game, then you're kind of missing the point of the book. That said, I think this book is fantastic. I've read it twice. It's definitely a favorite for me, and I would say it is for sure worth the hype. Next up, we have a thriller by a bit of a Booktube darling, Riley Sager. This is The Last Time I Lied. Now look, I know Riley Sager is generally a very popular author, especially on Booktube, but just in general. And I also know that people have very strong feelings about which of his books are the best or not the best. My personal favorite is a lot of other people's least favorite, so we're not going to talk about that one. What we are going to talk about is The Last Time I Lied, which is popular and I think for very good reason. This is a thriller that follows a woman who, as a young teen girl, had attended a summer camp and all of her cabin mates disappeared and were never found. Now, years later, she's an adult woman going back to the same summer camp that they are reopening again for the first time since those girls had disappeared. And she is going back as a painting instructor, but secretly with the agenda of trying to uncover what really happened to those girls back in that summer. I loved this. It's got lots of twists and turns. It's grappling with some really interesting ideas, and in my opinion, it kind of nailed the experience of being a young teen girl who's in the process of transitioning from childhood to adulthood and isn't quite sure how to do it very well. I think this book is very, very good and for sure worth the hype. So if you're interested in trying Riley Sager, this is not a bad place to start. Next up is an award winner that is also one of my favorites and a book that I have read twice. That is The Poet X by Elizabeth Acevedo. This is a YA novel in verse. It's a coming-of-age story following an Afro-Latinx teen girl named Xiomara who is trying to find her place in the world, find her voice, is grappling with confusing feelings about her body, and is struggling with the pressures and expectations of her traditional religious family on her as a young woman. I loved this a lot. I related to it quite a bit, and I have also read it twice. I've read it physically, but I've also listened to the audiobook, and Elizabeth Acevedo reads the audiobook herself and does a fantastic job. She began as a slam poet before becoming a novelist. I highly recommend this one and definitely think it is worth the hype. Next on the list is a big bestseller from 2020 that I really loved from an author that I really love, and that is Mexican Gothic by Silvia Moreno Garcia. This is a slow burn Gothic horror novel set in Mexico, and I love it. I think it's really brilliant. I will say, going in, know that it is for sure a slow burn. It starts out being creepy and atmospheric, but it definitely ramps up toward the end. If you need content warnings, you may want to check them out. I'm not going to talk about them here because they are spoilery, but I think this book is really brilliant, and it's using a lot of the horror tropes in the book as a way of talking about bigger issues like colonization and feminism and colonization of the body. I really loved it. I think it's very good. I found it to be pretty creepy, but if you're a big horror aficionado, it might not be super scary to you. Your mileage on that is going to vary, but if that sounds at all like your cup of tea, I think this book is very much worth the hype. Next on my list is a YA murder mystery that I think is done very, very well. That is The Cheerleaders by Kara Thomas. This follows a girl whose older sister had died along with several other of their high school cheerleaders when she was 16. The death was ruled a suicide, but now that younger sister is herself in high school and is starting to question whether her sister really did commit suicide or whether something more sinister was going on. She kind of plays the part of this amateur investigator trying to track down what really happened. This does touch on some heavier issues for a YA book, but I thought it was very well done, and I think that Kara Thomas does a good job of inhabiting the mindset of being a teenager. If you're looking for a YA murder mystery, I would for sure recommend The Cheerleaders, and if you've heard about it, again, it's worth the hype. Two more books to talk about. The next one is yet another horror novel. I'm not sure how that happened, but I have a lot of like horror and thriller books on this list, maybe because that's a lot of the standalones I read. This one was a surprise bestseller. I don't think people expected it to do as well as it did, but I think it is for sure deserved. The Southern Book Club's Guide to Slaying Vampires by Grady Hendrix. I think this book is so smart and so interesting. It's set in the suburban American South in the 1990s amongst a group of middle-aged women who have a book club where they read crime fiction and begin to suspect that a new neighbor might actually be a vampire. I'm gonna say up front, this book is not for the faint of heart. It does get pretty gritty and gruesome, especially later in the book. There are a lot of more traditional horror scenes in here, and I'm also going to give you some content warnings here for sexual assault and child predation that is on page and might be unsettling for some readers. So do be aware of what you're getting into here, but I think this book is so smart. I think what it's doing is really smart, and I think it is for sure worth the hype.
Hey guys, Editing Bethany here. I wanted to add one thing about the Southern Book Club's Guide to Slaying Vampires in terms of the themes that it's addressing. This is a book dealing with white flight and more subtle forms of racism. If you want to hear more detailed thoughts on this, I do have a more in-depth Goodreads review, and my Goodreads is always linked down below, but I wanted to give you guys some idea of what the themes of the book are. I think it is fantastically done, but it is one that has been somewhat polarizing, so just be aware.
And the final popular book that I want to talk about today is one that I saw on a lot of favorites lists for 2020 and just hit the New York Times bestseller list as a paperback, which I think is well deserved. That is The House in the Cerulean Sea by TJ Klune. Guys, I love this book so much. So much. And what's interesting to me is most of the negative reviews I've seen of this is saying that it's too fluffy and too sweet or saccharine. Fair, it is. It totally is. However, I would say that this is like a warm hug of a book. I loved it so much. It is a fantasy novel following a middle-aged man who is a bureaucrat who is supposed to oversee orphanages for magical children. And he goes off to this one on an island that is managed by this odd other middle-aged man, and there's a very slow burn, sweet romance that develops, but really it's the children. Like, the children had all of my heart. Chauncey, like, if you know, you know, and you've read this, I adored this book so much. It does also have a lot of social commentary on it, and it's not subtle, but I think that's okay. I don't think social commentary always needs to be subtle. I just loved it a lot. It was very sweet. It was very comforting. I think this is the book that we all needed in 2020, and if you have not yet picked it up, I'm here to tell you it is for sure worth the hype. That's my list of popular standalones that I think were worth the hype, but I would love to hear from you in the comments down below. For your question of the day, let me know what is a popular standalone book that you loved and you would say is worth the hype that it gets. Let me know in the comments down below. If you like this video, give it a thumbs up, subscribe if you want to see more, and if you want to support the work of the channel, check out the Patreon Patreon linked down below, or check out channel memberships if you want to get a sneak peek of all of my upcoming video projects. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.